Hi everyone, my name is Surina. I'm a surgical trainee doctor in the UK, working in the NHS, and I am officially 6 months into my training, so I thought I would have a little sit down with you today and have a bit of a chat about how it's all been going. I want to preface this video by saying it's been an absolutely mad privilege having the patient interactions and training time that I've had. Like, sometimes I'm literally in theatre holding a kidney or swiveling a camera around a bladder, and I just can't believe that is my job. With that being said, surgical training is hard. And if I'm being perfectly honest, I have found it a struggle at times. I've split this into 3 parts: the self, the skills, and the system. So let's dive right in. Firstly, the self. You think that I would have got all the finding myself out of my system on my gap year traveling, and unfortunately I found myself having to find myself. I think that makes sense. When I returned to full-time employment and surgical training in particular, I realised I had to find myself all over again. The surgical training pathway in the UK looks something like graduating medical school and then becoming a foundation doctor. This is F1 and F2. Within these 2 years of being a foundation doctor, you're rotating between different specialities in medicine and surgery and figuring out where you want to specialise. If you decide you want to specialise in surgery, you then apply for core surgical training, CT1 and CT2. I'm currently in my CT1 year, and within these 2 years of core training is when you rotate between different surgical specialities, figuring out which surgical speciality you want to further specialise in. After that, you apply for your registrar or higher level speciality training, which is ST3 to ST7 or 8. And that can be in general surgery or urology or plastic surgery or vascular surgery or whichever surgical speciality you've decided you want to specialise in. After you finish that training, you become a consultant in that surgical speciality. When you first become a doctor, as a foundation doctor, your learning needs are predominantly on the ward, learning how to manage a ward of patients, recognizing when patients are becoming really unwell, how to manage them, and how to escalate your concerns. When you become a surgical trainee, your learning needs shift to being predominantly based in the operating theatres, in clinics, in the emergency department, where you are dealing with surgery-specific scenarios, surgery-specific patients, and of course your surgical skills in the operating theatre. Making that shift from a more junior doctor to a surgical trainee doctor is something I found really difficult when I started. And this is for 2 main reasons. First and foremost, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it, the wards can be really busy, and sometimes staffing levels can be really low. This means the workload on the wards can build, and you find it very difficult and sometimes almost impossible to tear yourself away from this environment, and you begin to adopt more of a role of providing a service for the hospital rather than addressing your learning needs in other environments. Being a core surgical trainee doctor, you're in this very weird middle position where you are neither a very junior doctor, nor are you a senior specialised registrar level surgical trainee, where you have dedicated time and dedicated responsibilities that you need to show up for in theatres and clinics. You're kind of floating around in the middle, and the onus is very much on you to address your learning needs where you see fit. I found floating around in this middle limbo really difficult to understand what my role is and where I should be or what I should be doing on any given day. The second reason I found this really hard to balance and pull away from the wards is probably best told through this concept of learning zones. So with these learning zone layers, you have your comfort zone in the middle. This is probably what I would describe the wards to be. I've been a doctor for quite a few years now, and so the wards is what is familiar to me. Doesn't mean that it's easy, doesn't mean that you get it right every time, of course, but it's definitely an environment that is safe and familiar to me relatively to everything else I need to be doing, and so it's where I feel safe and where I feel most in control. Although that is a comfort zone, my learning zone is where I need to be challenging myself and where I need to be learning new knowledge and new skills at this stage. To get to that learning zone, you have to cross this fear zone in the middle, where you might have a bit of a shake in your confidence, where you might be questioning yourself and your abilities, and that is a very uncomfortable process, which I will talk about shortly. The learning in the learning zone has been absolutely huge. Early on, I thought all I had to do was turn up to theatre and just be present and absorb the learning. And you realize you don't really know who the patient is in front of you and why they are on the operating table. So you start reading up before the theatre list, and then you arrive and you realize that you should have actually been seeing the patients before they were in theatre to make sure they understand the procedure, to introduce yourself, and to go through the consenting process with them. And on this side of it all, when I say it all like that, it does seem really basic and obvious to me. Maybe I was a little bit slow and naive, and maybe some of you watching this would pick this up pretty quickly. But for me, it's really about being told what the needs are. I honestly feel like at times being in a surgical training program is almost like being in a toxic relationship, or just any relationship actually. I can't read its mind and second guess what is expected of me. I need good, honest, open communication to be told what is needed, and then I can act on those things and hopefully progress. But that was a bit of a learning curve, especially towards the beginning, was really separating myself away from what was familiar and kind of chucking myself into this uncomfortable learning zone. And within that, figuring out what it was that I actually needed to learn in order to become a surgeon, which was so much more than just the surgery itself. My main learning point from this would be to just ask, and ask. When I think back to how I was always second guessing what was expected of me and trying to figure out what I should or should not be doing, I just think about how much time and brain overdrive could have been saved if I just asked the question. I know why I didn't at the time. It's because I felt like it was too basic or too stupid and not even worth asking. But honestly, there is no such question. I remember months and months down the line when a senior asked me how this piece of equipment that I've been using again and again worked, and I couldn't tell her, and I just felt so stupid. And it's because I had those questions earlier, months ago, but I just didn't think to ask because I thought it was too basic. But when it came to being questioned about it, I couldn't really explain it, and that was just really silly. So I really wish I'd asked more questions earlier so it didn't come to bite me back in the bum later. And that takes me on to my second section, which is the skills. So surgical skills is arguably the best and worst learning curve I have ever been on. It is an emotional roller coaster. There are times when you manage to do even the smallest thing, just something really, really well, or you did it better than last time and you feel like $1 million, and then it all just comes crashing down like the next case or the next day, and you just feel so awful. You feel embarrassed, and honestly, at times I'm like, what is the point? Like, I'm just not meant to be here. I'm not good at this. Screw it. Learning how to do any operation is so much more than just the actual operative procedure and the surgical skills itself. It starts all the way at the beginning of the list when you need to tell the surgical team what equipment you need. Then you need to get the patient in the proper position, so after they're put to sleep by the anesthetic. Then it's about prepping and draping the patient, so how do you make sure everything's sterile. Then how do you access the area of interest that you're operating on, so what kind of incision, where, what size, what do you need to dissect, what do you need to keep safe. Then you perform the operation, whatever it may be, and then you need to restore kind of functional or normal or as normal anatomy as possible. You need to close up, you need to put a dressing on, and you need to think about post-operative recovery. So this whole thing is part of doing one operation. This is great because there is so much to be learned. I found every interaction with patients, every time I was in theatre, to be such a big learning process because there was a small part of that whole puzzle that I was slowly putting together. You know, at the beginning, I didn't know how to position patients for cystoscopies, which is where you do a camera test that looks into the bladder. I didn't know how to do the positioning. I didn't know how to put on the special types of drapes you need. And you're just so nervous that you're going to touch the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, and you're overthinking every single move you make. And fast forward a few months and you're doing that all in one sort of big fluent motion, and you don't really recognize how much you've learnt until you look back and you realize what effort that was the first time you learnt it all. So it's been a really, really nice and satisfying learning curve because you can actively see yourself getting better and more fluent. But the huge downside to such a steep learning curve is that firstly, it's not always nice and linear, like it is really a curve. and it being so steep, it is very easy to kind of slide down and fall back quite quickly if you follow this extended metaphor somewhat. For example, there'll be a part of the operation that I'm really keen to learn. So for example, in laparoscopic surgery, that is keyhole surgery, I wanted to learn how to make the incision sites for the operating tools and for the operating camera, how to do that safely and how to do that independently. Once I finally got it in one procedure, I remember being so happy and I was on such a great high. And then of course, at the end of every operation, it's time to close the incisions you make. And closing wounds is one of the first things you will probably get involved with if you're in theatre and learning how to do surgery. And so it's something I had done so many times before, yet when it came to doing, I think I was doing a hand tie where you're knotting your suturing thread to close the wound nicely, and I just couldn't do it. And although I'd learnt something that was, maybe a bit harder, maybe a bit newer, and I was feeling so happy with myself, I then found I couldn't do this very basic thing I'd done so many times before. And it is so crushing, it is so embarrassing when you're doing this in front of your consultant and they have to take over or teach you how to do it again, and you just feel really silly. These experiences can be framed in two very different lights. There is that learning zone mindset where you are embracing all of these things like challenges, things that you need to work on and do better next time. But there is also that slightly more negative fear zone mindset where you start to question your confidence, you become quite frustrated, and you basically kind of get in the way of your own learning. And if I'm being honest, I do slip into that negative mindset probably more often than I'd like to admit. I think that's probably for two main reasons, and firstly is comparison. When you start off as a core surgical trainee, you're starting off with lots of other people at the same level of training as you are, but everyone varies hugely in their experiences, in how quickly they pick things up. And so there probably is a lot of variability between us and our skills and our learning journeys. However, I know when I'm doing something and it's not quite to the standard I wanted it, then I'm immediately wondering whether other people are doing better than me, whether I'm working at the level that's expected, and whether I'm just way worse than anyone they've seen before. And you just kind of slip into this very negative mindset where you're not really thinking about your skills and what you need to improve. You've kind of got all of this other external chatter going on in your brain, which really gets in the way of that learning experience. And so my first learning point here would definitely be that comparison is the thief of joy, because surgical training should be fun. I mean, you're literally doing, I think, the coolest stuff in the hospital. You are in people's bodies, taking things out, putting them back together, moving things, cutting stuff. It's just so cool. Then you're putting them back together, they're waking up and hopefully having a better life for it, which is absolutely wild. But I know when I give all those voices about comparing myself with others a lot of brain time, they occupy a lot of brain space, and that really just takes the joy out of the whole process. So it's taken me quite a long time to try and even start unlearning that, and I've got a lot of work to do. The second reason, I think, is having unrealistic expectations. I remember way back in August, September time when I was starting out, every part of that operation journey was a really big deal. All those basic surgical skills that don't seem so basic when you first learn them, you very much begin to adapt to them. Once you do them a few times, they become second nature very easily, and your expectations for what you should be able to do just keeps increasing exponentially as well. I remember when I was doing a procedure, probably the second or third time I'd ever even seen it in my life, I was so frustrated that I couldn't do it from beginning to end by myself, and that my registrar was stepping in and doing lots of bits and pieces of it, and I felt like that was something that I should have been able to do. But thinking back now, it's ridiculous that I thought after seeing it a couple of times I could have done it completely by myself, and having those expectations were really quite unrealistic. You think once you start learning the basics, you should learn everything much faster after that, but the thing is, surgery is difficult. Surgery is not a natural skill that you are just born being able to do. Sure, some people can be good with their hands, have good control, have good hand-eye coordination, and those things can definitely help, but being able to actually do surgery is not a natural skill in terms of tissue handling, in terms of gauging which maneuvers can unlock easier ways of doing things. That all just comes by doing and doing and doing. And thinking you're going to get that immediately is quite unrealistic. Something that really helped me understand this was, weirdly, this Reddit thread that my partner, who also does surgery, sent me. And I just found it really, really reassuring. And I might just read a part of it now, actually. So for context, someone who at a similar level of training I'm at asked, how do I get good at basic surgical skills? I keep doing them, but I still keep messing up in theatre. Very relatable. So this person, who's probably a bit more senior, replied saying, surgery is really, really difficult. Nobody is a natural at surgery. The defining qualities for excellent surgeons are who keep turning up, who keep paying attention, and who keep putting in the effort. The master has failed more times than the apprentice has tried. There's a reason it's a numbers game. If you've closed 10,000 wounds, you'll be better than someone who's done 100. And yeah, there's loads of good stuff in here. I'm not going to read it all out. My second learning point would be that surgery is difficult, just keep turning up. And finally, I want to talk about the system. The culture and system within which surgery operates, no pun intended, has been known to have quite a reputation in the past. Not all of it positive, of course. Traditionally, surgery has been a very male-dominated career, full of lots of type A personalities who are hyper competitive, and it's known to have quite a cutthroat and ruthless atmosphere at times. All of this has improved massively over the years, and I have so many positives to share with you, but I do want to start by dwelling on the darker side of surgery that I've experienced so far first. Over these past few months, I have witnessed and experienced inappropriate verbal and body language directed towards me. My commitment to the career has also been questioned when I've not agreed with coming in over an hour before my shift time starts. And I've heard numerous stories from my colleagues, a lot of them female, who've experienced similar things in their careers as well. Perhaps I was a little naive going into this career, thinking all these stories were a thing of the deep past, but I have been really shocked to see that certain things are still happening today. I've been very torn about whether to talk about this on here. I simultaneously don't want to just brush it under the carpet and pretend it's not still happening, but also this isn't really the right place to escalate things and actually resolve them. I feel really, really supported by my trust and by my colleagues, and things have been escalated appropriately, and yeah, I feel very supported overall. But I think it is important to speak about it, to say that this culture does still exist, not as a deterrent for future trainees who want to go down the surgical path, but more as a word of reality, that if you choose to come down this career path, you will have to learn to stand up for yourself and for your boundaries. And the earlier you know this, the earlier you can start to prepare and practice. Obviously, I am just getting started and learning how to navigate this system and how to deal with these situations that arise. I'm sure some of my views will evolve as I get further into this career and gain more experience. But for now, there are parts of surgery culture that I would like to see change, and I know that making these changes and following in the footsteps of some amazing seniors who have already started making these changes is what drives me and excites me about this career as well. Maybe it's not the best motive to do something just to prove a point, but honestly I do feel like sometimes I am in surgery just to prove that someone like me, someone that looks like me, someone that has the lifestyle aspirations like me can not only survive but also thrive in this career. So I'm still very, very happy to be a part of it and very much recommend it. So I hope lots of other like-minded people join me and help change the culture, which is already changing in front of my eyes. There are so many more positives that outweigh the negatives by far. In the last few months, I have met colleagues who have been less than full-time, mostly all female and mostly all for childcare reasons, but I already have friends in orthopedic surgery and one in general surgery who have gone less than full-time as juniors, who don't have families, who don't have children, and are just seeking a more appropriate work-life balance for them. So importance of work-life balance and acceptance of less than full-time training is slowly but surely coming. You can be in this career and have other interests and priorities as well. I've got so many colleagues, mostly female actually, who are hitting the gym several times a week, going swimming, kickboxing, competing in multiple triathlons, competing in bodybuilding competitions, and still making a career as a surgeon work for them. It's been so cool to meet so many more women in this career than there were when I was in medical school just a few years ago. In fact, I've just moved on from urology to general surgery, and my department is majority female consultants. I think there's 4 or 5 females and only 1 or 2 males, which I have literally never seen in any surgical department ever that I've worked in the world. And the atmosphere is not so hyper competitive and cutthroaty as maybe one might expect. Everyone is just there to enjoy and to learn. There's always a really good atmosphere of people working together, trying to find research opportunities that we can do together. There's a good social side in terms of going out for meals and drinks. Yeah, it's like a really, really nice environment that you don't need to be a single straight-minded, very serious or very competitive person to thrive in. Like, everyone is quite normal and nice and friendly. So yeah, my learning point will be that doing things just to prove a point is fine. You have to enjoy it to be able to last the whole way. But I think there is a lot of merit and a lot to be said for being the type of person that you want to see in a certain field is a good way to bring about that change. So I'm very happy to be here. To finish, I asked on Instagram if you guys had any specific other questions about core surgical training. I had quite a few come in, so I'll just answer a few here now. Do you have to learn to become not squeamish, or does open flesh genuinely not bother you? I love the open flesh. Really takes the glamour out of surgery, because yes, we are all just sacks of flesh with bits and bobs floating around inside. It is quite gross and weird, actually. Fun fact, I used to be extremely squeamish when I was a kid. Actually, I dug up something I wrote when I was 11 or 12, which literally had the sentence of, "I hate blood and body bits, so I don't think I will ever become a doctor," written in plain sight for everyone to see. And that didn't really work out, did it? So in answer to your question, I guess you do desensitize generally in medicine to lots of things. You desensitize to lots of sights and smells and emotions because you have to. So yeah, I think it doesn't really bother me anymore. In fact, I don't know if I should be admitting this, but when you're kind of burning blood vessels, there's a lot of burning in theatre, and that smell of kind of burnt human tissue kind of smells quite nice and comforting after a while. It's just when you begin to settle into theatre, it kind of becomes a familiar smell. So yeah, I guess you kind of do just get over it and it doesn't bother you. As a core trainee, how often do you get to be in theatres? This varies hugely from speciality to speciality, department to department, hospital to hospital. There is such a wide spectrum of stories and experiences from all my surgical colleagues. It varies a lot with how well staffed the ward is, how many on-call shifts you're doing, and how many lists and clinic opportunities there are. So in my hospital, there is literally not enough rooms for even the registrars and consultants to do their clinics in. And so there's no way I can really get my own clinic room and have that kind of learning experience. However, for theatres, there is so much operating going on. I'm spoilt for choice with lists. And as I've gotten better at managing the ward, knowing when to step in, knowing when to step away, I was going to sort of maybe 2-3 lists a week on average, so 2 or 3 operating days a week. That would sometimes drop down to 0 or 1 if I was on call a lot, if the wards weren't staffed very well. So it really varies from week to week. Got a few questions about getting onto training. So how did you get onto training? What are your CST interview tips? How did you do the MSRA? So I could do a whole video on this, but essentially currently to get into training, you need to apply with a portfolio, which there is a whole points criteria laid out for what gets you points. If you score highly enough, then you'll be invited to an interview. You also have to do an exam, the MSRA exam. Your score on that also determines whether you get an interview. There's lots of information online about what the process is. I will link any information on portfolios and the process in the description box below. Has surgical training reignited your passion for medicine? That's a really interesting one. It suggests that the passion was not there one point. And I think that's pretty fair. After a few years of doing non-specialist training, you do kind of detach from that feeling of progression and feeling of going up a career ladder. So I think coming back on that ladder, coming back onto a formal training program, and that too in something I'm finding really enjoyable and satisfying most of the time, has really helped to kind of help me regain focus and regain kind of goals to work towards. So yes, it has. And final question is, how do you balance staying fit, seeing friends and family whilst being a surgical trainee? The fact is that I do have less time than if I wasn't doing surgery. So like last year I wasn't working, but the reality is that when I have less time, I am forced to be more disciplined and be a lot more intentional with what I use my time for. So actually, when I was on my year off, I had probably the worst routine that even was a routine in terms of sleep and diet, exercise, hobbies. Everything was just all a bit all over the place. And it's only now when I know X amount of hours a day, X amount of hours a week I am in full-time employment at the hospital that I have to fit other things around it. And so those things actually get done more than they ever were before. I know now that on my days off, gym has to be a priority because it's a lot easier on those days, and I have, at least 2 days off a week. So that's 2 sessions done. Then the 3rd and 4th session, if that even happens, is a bonus. And I know I have to do that before work because after work I am too tired. I know I can't do them on long days where I'm working 12-hour shifts because it's too tiring. So therefore, if I'm on a normal day, like an 8 to 5 day, then I know those are gym days. I know days off are gym days. With seeing friends and family, it's just all about scheduling in advance. I find that there's so many celebratory events that actually most of my social life ends up being scheduled by default. And so that's really it. There's not really any magic or any crazy productivity hacks or, waking up at 4 in the morning and doing a crazy routine or whatever. None of that. It's just about slotting things into where it makes sense, and I'm actually finding it a lot easier than I found it when I had no routine. That's everything for now. If you enjoyed this video, check out some days in the life videos I've done. I hope you found this video enjoyable, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.